Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
A biker grabbed my arm outside the pharmacy and sneered like he'd just won something. Like maybe he thought his leather vest and beer gut gave him the upper hand over a woman he assumed was weak because she walked with a cane. "Daddy's not here to protect you now, blind girl," he spat, his breath sour and close, the kind of stench that sticks to your throat. I tilted my head toward him, took a breath that didn't shake, and said calmly, "You're right, he sent someone else." I didn't need to see the look of confusion on his face to know it was there. There's a special kind of silence that falls when a man thinks he has the upper hand and suddenly realizes he's wrong. It's heavy, it sticks to the air like the calm before a summer storm. And right before the weight of that moment dropped on him, the sound of heavy boots on concrete echoed across the parking lot. Rhythmic, intentional, not running, just moving like whoever they belonged to had all the time in the world and zero doubt about what was about to happen. I felt the biker's grip tighten, just for a second, just long enough for me to know he was startled. Then I heard it, a grunt, a body shifting too fast, a dull thud, and the squeal of leather against pavement. His grip fell away. I adjusted my coat sleeve and took a small step back, tapping the edge of my cane on the cracked sidewalk to reorient myself. "You've got about 10 seconds to tell me why you're following her," a deep voice growled, close enough that I could hear the slight rasp in his throat, the kind that comes from years of unfiltered cigarettes and unsaid things. The biker, his name would turn out to be Tommy Malone, but I didn't know that yet, spat something angry and scrambled to his feet. But it didn't matter. The other man, the one with the boots, was already walking away, calm as a Sunday sermon. I stood still for a few beats, letting the adrenaline pass through me like water through a cracked dam, and then turned in the direction of the boots. "Grizzly," I said, my voice flatter than it should have been, too calm for someone who just got grabbed in a pharmacy parking lot. "Hello, Rachel," he said, like he'd just seen me at a family reunion and not after 6 years of silence. I clenched my jaw, not because I was scared, not because of Tommy, but because this man, this walking storm of secrets and regrets, had just waltzed back into my life like my world hadn't been burning down slowly ever since my dad died. I took 2 steps forward and punched him square in the gut. It wasn't elegant, and I definitely felt it more than he did, but I needed to do it. I needed him to know that showing up unannounced didn't mean forgiveness. He grunted, not in pain, but more like a grunt of acknowledgement. And then he laughed, not loud, not mocking, but low and familiar, like the sound of an old truck turning over in the cold. "You always had your mother's temper," he said. "And you always had a death wish," I shot back. He didn't argue. We ended up at a diner off Route 53, the one with the checkered linoleum floors and the coffee that tastes like burnt rubber and bad decisions. He ordered black coffee. I didn't order anything. I just sat there, gripping the table edge, trying not to let my hands shake, trying not to let the past start bleeding into the present like it always does when Grizzly shows up. "You want to tell me why some punk with a knife and a chip on his shoulder knows who I am and where to find me?" I asked. Grizzly took a slow sip of his coffee, and for a second, I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Because your daddy left more than a few ghosts behind," he finally said. "And not all of them stayed buried." I leaned back in the booth, chewing on the inside of my cheek. My father had been dead for 6 years. They said it was a car accident. Rain, a blown tire, no foul play. That's what the official report said. But when you grow up with a man like my dad, who used burner phones like most people use Kleenex, and told bedtime stories that involved encrypted codes and black sites, you learn to keep your doubts close and your suspicions closer. I had my suspicions. I always did. I folded my hands in front of me and said, "So what, you're here to protect me now? Out of guilt? Or just because someone owes you a favor?" Grizzly didn't blink. I could hear it in his voice, that edge he always carried, like he was never quite out of a war zone. "I'm here because your dad told me to be," he said. Last I checked, the dead don't give orders, I said. Grizzly leaned forward, lowering his voice like it mattered. Not unless they planned for it. He slid an envelope across the table, the kind of envelope that crackled when you touched it, heavy with something inside that wasn't just paper. I reached out slowly, fingers skimming across the surface, until I found the flap. It wasn't sealed. I pulled the contents out, a flash drive, a single key, and a note in my dad's handwriting. I didn't need to see the letters to know it was his writing. The way the paper was folded, the indentation of the pen, the uneven spacing from his left-handed scrawl. My thumb ran across the indentations like braille. Rachel, the note began. If you're reading this, it means things have gone to hell. That's when I knew this wasn't just some coincidence. The guy in the parking lot wasn't some creep. He was a warning shot, a signal. And this wasn't over, not even close. What hit me the hardest wasn't the fear, though yeah, it was there, or the sense that my whole life was about to tilt sideways again. It was the simple, undeniable truth I had spent years trying to ignore. My dad hadn't died because of a car crash. He died because of something he knew, and someone out there still wanted to keep it buried. It had arrived 5 days earlier, stuffed between a stack of catalogs and a gas bill. I had no real interest in paying on time. A thick, unmarked envelope without a return address. And although there was nothing outwardly unusual about it, something in the weight of it, in the way the corner of it pressed harder than paper should against my thumb, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hadn't opened it immediately. I'd let it sit on the kitchen table for a few hours, maybe longer than I should have. And each time I walked past it, I felt its presence more distinctly, like the envelope was aware I was avoiding it and wanted to remind me that whatever was inside wouldn't go away just because I ignored it. When I finally slit the edge open with a steak knife that had seen more Amazon boxes than actual steaks, I wasn't prepared for what spilled out. A smooth USB flash drive with a scuffed corner, a small metal key that jingled like it belonged to a lockbox or a drawer, and a single sheet of paper, thick, aged slightly around the edges, and written in my father's unmistakable left-handed scrawl. My throat tightened the second my fingers brushed across the paper. I hadn't touched his handwriting in over half a decade, not since the condolence letters stopped arriving and the army had packed up what was left of his personal effects in a tan box they didn't even bother to label properly. I used the OCR app on my phone to scan the letter. It took a few tries because of the damn shadows in the kitchen, but when the robotic voice finally began to read the words back to me, my knees actually buckled a little, not because it was emotional, though it was, but because hearing his words read out loud made it feel like he was sitting right there across from me, like he hadn't been buried on a hill in Arlington with an American flag folded tight against my chest. Rachel, the voice began, mechanical and flat, but the words still cut clean. If you're hearing this, it means the situation has escalated, and you're no longer safe being who you are. I wanted to protect you from this, from all of it. But if this has reached you, it means my past has finally caught up with you. Inside the coin is the first piece. You'll know which one. That was it. No explanation of what coin he meant, no mention of where it was hidden, and not even a hint of what the situation was. The note was exactly what my father would have written, vague, strategic, and laced with more questions than answers. It pissed me off, honestly. It always had, the way he talked around the truth like it was classified even inside our own house, like I couldn't handle the truth if it wasn't handed to me in puzzle form. I shoved the USB into the old laptop I kept under the counter and waited for it to whir to life, wondering the whole time if I was about to open some government kill switch or just a folder full of passwords and paranoia. What came up instead was a grainy video, recorded in what looked like a hotel room with bad lighting and one of those beige walls that all budget motels seem to share. My dad was sitting on the edge of the bed, older than I remembered him in my last real memories, eyes sunken and tired, hair thinner, but his voice, when it came, still held that dry, deliberate cadence that said he'd chosen every word carefully. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person," he said. "But there are people still out there, people who think you know more than you do, people who think you've got something you don't. If Grizzly's with you, then you're not alone. Trust him, but don't trust anyone else. Not yet. The video cut off before I could process it fully. No goodbye, no sign-off, just a flicker of static and a blank screen. I sat there in silence for several minutes, the refrigerator humming behind me, the walls pressing in like the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I realized something simple, something terrifying. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. Later that night, I told myself to forget about it, that it was just another breadcrumb trail from a man who never quite managed to let the war stay overseas. But then I started noticing things. The mailbox left open after I knew I'd closed it, the hum of a car engine outside my house that didn't belong to any of my neighbors, the way my dog Copper started growling at shadows instead of sleeping soundly through the night like he always did. And then came the incident outside the pharmacy, the moment where Tommy Malone grabbed my arm like I was some civilian caught in the crosshairs of a game I didn't know the rules to. But the way he spoke, his words weren't just designed to scare me. They were designed to remind me of something, to taunt me with knowledge he shouldn't have had. He knew my dad's name. He knew I was blind, and more importantly, he seemed certain I was alone. He wasn't expecting Grizzly, neither was I, if we're being honest. The last time I'd seen that mountain of a man was at my father's funeral, and even then, he didn't say a word. He just stood there in the back row like a silent sentinel, hands clasped, eyes hidden behind old aviators, the kind of guy you'd guess had more scars than stories, and more stories than people who were still alive to verify them. When he sat across from me in the diner after taking Tommy down, I could hear the hesitation in his breath, not fear, just the heavy burden of someone who knew they were walking a landmine field made of old secrets and broken promises. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. The waitress came by and poured coffee without asking. She knew his face. That meant something. That meant he'd been here before. Watching, maybe, waiting. "You remember that motel we stayed at outside Clarksville when you were 10? He asked finally, and for a moment I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "You mean the one where Dad pretended it was a family vacation but kept checking the locks every 10 minutes?" I said. "Yeah, that one," he replied, sipping his coffee. "That's where he met the guy who started all this." I didn't say anything, but I think he could tell from the way I leaned in that I needed more. And he gave it, slowly, carefully, as if each word was a thread pulled from a much larger knot. "Your dad and I, we weren't just Army," he said. "We were part of something off the books. Something that started in Nicaragua and ended, well, it hasn't ended yet. That's why I'm here, because you're the last loose end." That word, loose end, sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just a label, it was a target. And it meant this thing, whatever it was, hadn't just landed on my doorstep by accident. It had been coming for years, maybe decades, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And now that it had, I had to decide whether I was going to keep running from a past I never signed up for, or start unraveling it, thread by dangerous thread. The next morning broke in silence, the kind that doesn't belong to a town waking up, but to one that's already holding its breath. And as I stood on the back porch nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold before I even took my second sip, I found myself tracing the grain in the wooden railing with my fingers, thinking about how quickly the familiar could turn unfamiliar once you started questioning what had always seemed harmless. There had always been a slowness to this town, a certain predictability that made it feel safe in a fragile, small-town America kind of way, where the biggest excitement was a high school football win or a bake sale at the church down the hill. But now, even the breeze felt off. Like the air itself was watching, waiting, carrying secrets from one rusted mailbox to the next. Grizzly was already up, of course. He didn't seem like the kind of man who ever truly slept. And I could hear the steady rhythm of him cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table, a sound I remembered from childhood, but never really understood until now. I walked back inside, letting the screen door creak behind me, and leaned against the fridge with my arms folded, trying to ignore the way my pulse still hadn't quite returned to normal. "Someone was outside again last night," I said, not really asking. Grizzly didn't look up, just continued wiping down the barrel with methodical precision, like he was sharpening a truth instead of a weapon. They left boot prints in the garden, I added. Copper found them before dawn. Deep tread, steel-toed, not the kind of boots worn by someone delivering mail. Grizzly gave the faintest nod, one that carried more weight than words, and then finally spoke, his voice low and heavy, like gravel soaked in gasoline. They're watching to see what you'll do next. They don't want to make the first move unless they're sure you've got what they think you do. And what exactly do they think I have? I asked, more frustrated than afraid, though the line between the two was beginning to blur faster than I liked. Grizzly set the rifle down carefully, like a man placing something sacred on an altar, and looked in my direction with that same unreadable intensity he'd carried since the day we met. Your father kept a record, a list, names, locations, routes, and transactions tied to illegal weapons trades going back over 15 years. He compiled it off the books, stored it in pieces across different safe houses, with only one complete version encrypted and hidden away. He never told me where it was, only that if something happened to him, you'd be the only one who could figure it out. I wanted to scream at him, to ask why a man like my father, who claimed to want a peaceful life for his only child, would drop this kind of burden onto my shoulders like it was some twisted inheritance wrapped in patriotism and silence. But I didn't scream. I just took a long, slow breath and asked, "And they think I've already found it?" "Or that you will," he said, "which makes you a problem." There's something sobering about being told, without drama or exaggeration, that your existence has become inconvenient to people who operate outside the reach of laws and morality. It strips away the illusion of safety faster than any gunshot ever could. That was the morning we decided to set the trap. The plan wasn't complicated, because complications get people killed. We picked an old gas station out on Route 20, the kind that used to serve truckers, but had been boarded up for years. After the owner disappeared under suspicious circumstances, no one in town seemed too interested in solving. It was remote enough to avoid attention, but still close enough to town to be plausible as a meeting spot. The idea was simple: bait them with movement, give them just enough noise to think we were scrambling, and see who came to sniff it out. Grizzly hacked a shortwave frequency, something he claimed he hadn't done in years, but executed with the ease of a man who never really stopped, and dropped a carefully worded message in an open channel that mentioned the girl and the list. He made sure the signal sounded rushed and accidental, as if we hadn't meant for anyone to hear it. Then we waited, and when night fell, they came. The first one arrived on a Harley that still had the dealership tag swinging off the license plate, which told me more than I wanted to know about how recently they'd set up shop in town. He didn't try to hide. He parked under the broken canopy, lit a cigarette with a hand that shook just slightly, and radioed in a confirmation using a scrambled code that even I could tell was old-school government issue. The second one came 15 minutes later in a battered Ford Bronco, with the windows blacked out and a shotgun rack bolted to the ceiling. He didn't get out of the truck, but he rolled the window down and leaned back like he was settling in for a show. Grizzly was hidden in the mechanic's bay, motionless behind a stack of tires, with his rifle propped against the edge of a rusted lift. I was inside the old cashier's office with my earpiece in, Copper lying at my feet, completely silent except for the occasional twitch of his ears. We waited like that for another 20 minutes, hearts ticking in time with the silence, until the third man showed up. This one was different. He didn't ride a bike or drive a car. He walked in from the woods like he'd been there the whole time, like he wasn't arriving so much as emerging. He wore all black, no patches, no colors, and he carried himself with the kind of stillness that speaks of long discipline and worse decisions. He circled the gas station slowly, taking note of the angles, the shadows, the exits. I couldn't see his face, but I didn't need to. I could feel him sizing up every inch of the building, every weakness, every possible outcome. And then he stopped. He spoke into a device clipped to his collar, but I caught only 2 words: no contact. That was all I needed to know. He wasn't just some enforcer sent to scare us. He was something else entirely. That's when I gave Grizzly the signal. The lights we'd rigged to a generator snapped on, flooding the parking lot with harsh white glare, and the suddenness of it froze all three men in place, just long enough for us to move. Grizzly took the high ground and dropped the first biker with a tranquilizer round. We didn't want bodies, not yet. I moved quickly to lock the office door, keeping Copper close, while the second man in the Bronco peeled out in reverse, crashing through a ditch as he tried to escape. The third man, whoever he was, didn't run. He simply stepped into the shadows and vanished like smoke. We secured the captured biker in the storage room and stripped him of everything but his jeans. Grizzly kept a gun trained on him while I interrogated, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in the biker's eyes. Not fear, not pain, just a faint awareness that I was more than the blind girl they'd been sent to observe. "You're her," he said hoarsely, like my name was something forbidden. "You're the one they said might remember." "Remember what?" I asked, but he was already shaking his head. "They said you were just a kid when it happened. They didn't think you'd know where the coin was." "What coin?" I pressed, but he bit down hard and collapsed forward, unconscious. A tooth lay on the ground by his boot. He'd swallowed something, a capsule most likely, the kind that shut down your nervous system if you knew too much and weren't supposed to talk. We left him tied up for the sheriff, anonymous tip and all. By the time we got back to my place, the porch light had been smashed, and the screen door hung open like a jaw unhinged. Sitting on the steps was a Polaroid. Me, Grizzly, the diner. Someone had taken it from the booth behind us. They weren't just watching anymore. They were moving. And we were officially out of time. There are moments when the weight of truth lands so heavily across your shoulders that you feel, even if only for a breath, as though your spine might splinter under the pressure of it. And as Grizzly paced the length of my small living room, that now looked more like a makeshift war room than a place where anyone ever lived a normal life. Maps spread across the coffee table, red string connecting names and dates, surveillance photos pinned to the corkboard I used to hang holiday cards on. I found myself quietly tracing the edge of the Polaroid that had been left on my porch, the glossy surface still cool to the touch, and warped slightly at one corner where dew or sweat or fear had soaked into the paper. Someone had taken that photo without us noticing. Someone had stood close enough to catch our faces clearly in the frame, and neither of us had felt a damn thing at the time, which bothered Grizzly more than he let on, and kept me from sleeping longer than I'd care to admit. It wasn't just that they were watching. That had been obvious since the brake line incident, and the shadow outside my house, 2 nights prior. It was the level of coordination, the cold precision behind it, the way every move felt like it was being answered by a counter move, like we were playing chess against someone who had seen all our games before and was now just pushing pieces for fun, because the outcome had already been decided in some dark office miles away. "They've been here longer than I thought," Grizzly muttered finally, more to himself than to me, his voice tight with frustration and something else, something like guilt, though he'd never admit it out loud. "You mean watching me?" I asked, though the question felt rhetorical the second it left my mouth. He paused, then exhaled hard through his nose, a sound I'd come to recognize as the auditory version of a reluctant admission. "Watching this town," he said, "watching the people in it. Your father always believed the real danger wouldn't come from some foreign agent or rogue contractor. It would come from people we knew, from the inside, the kind of people who could sit at your table, ask about your dog, and still pull the trigger if the order came through." I wanted to tell him that sounded paranoid, that he was spinning ghosts into monsters, but the truth was sitting in my hands in the form of a photograph someone shouldn't have been able to take. And outside, Copper was pacing by the window again, ears twitching every few seconds like he could hear things the rest of us had tuned out years ago. It was Grizzly who suggested we go back through my father's old things, not the military memorabilia or the carefully folded flags and commendations he'd kept in his den, but the storage unit on the outskirts of town, the one listed under an alias I hadn't thought about in years, a name he used for motel check-ins and burner phones, James Cutter. That name had only ever surfaced when something dangerous was happening, something too volatile to tie back to his real life. And it had been buried alongside the rest of the things I hadn't wanted to remember after they told me he'd lost control of the vehicle, veered off the road, and burned alive before the medics ever got there. I didn't know what we were looking for exactly, but Grizzly seemed to. Or at least he had the instinct of someone who'd spent most of his life pulling threads from other men's lies and waiting to see what unraveled. The unit was dusty, untouched for years, filled with plastic containers and locked steel boxes, each marked only with a number and a single word. Echo, Delta, Thorn, names that meant nothing to me but made Grizzly flinch almost imperceptibly, like he was seeing old ghosts scratch at the walls. He zeroed in on a weathered green case that looked like it had seen 2 wars and been dragged through both of them. I heard the click of the key, the same one that had come in the envelope days earlier, and the sharp metallic hiss of the lock giving way, followed by the quiet shifting of contents as Grizzly lifted the lid and pulled out a thin, hardback case, the kind used for medals and awards. Inside it, tucked beneath a velvet lining, was a row of coins. Military challenge coins, each representing a different unit, a different operation. And just as I was about to ask what the hell we were doing rifling through these, my fingers brushed one that felt different. It wasn't the weight that gave it away, or even the engraving, which was barely legible, but the subtle ridge along the edge, like a seam waiting to be pulled apart. I turned it slowly in my hand, following the groove with my thumb, and heard the faintest click, a sound so soft you wouldn't catch it unless you were listening for it with every nerve in your body. And then the coin cracked open to reveal a microchip, no larger than a fingernail, sealed inside a clear capsule. Grizzly leaned closer, eyes narrowing, voice low. "That's the list," he said. "That's what they're hunting for." Back at the house, we loaded the chip into a secure drive, bypassing the usual systems Grizzly didn't trust anymore. And as the files decrypted one by one, a sickening sense of clarity began to settle over me. Names, dozens of them, began appearing on the screen. Some I didn't recognize, but others I knew. Local officials, military contractors, former agents, even a few sitting justices whose names had been whispered through my father's phone line once, years ago, on a night when I wasn't supposed to be awake but had listened anyway, curled under the kitchen table with a blanket and a flashlight like some kind of makeshift spy. Each file was dated, time-stamped, with transactions and movements, photographic evidence, routes for weapons shipments disguised as medical relief, payments made under shell companies with names like Blue Ribbon Logistics and New Century Training Services. This wasn't just some relic of a Cold War conspiracy or a paranoid veteran's scrapbook of imagined crimes. It was real, it was current. And it implicated people who had never been held accountable, not because they were innocent, but because they were insulated. But the most disturbing file wasn't the largest one or the one marked with red flags in the metadata. It was a short audio recording labeled only with a date, December 14th, 2018, the night my father died. Grizzly played it without hesitation, and what we heard was enough to change everything. Static at first, then the sound of rain, heavy and insistent against the windshield of a moving vehicle. My father's voice came through, clipped and urgent, speaking to someone named Rourke, telling him that the list was out, that the information had leaked, and that Rachel, me, had to be protected at all costs. Rourke's reply was short, cold, efficient. "We'll take care of it." Then silence, and then faintly a third voice, one I didn't recognize, but Grizzly did. "Monroe," he said, almost choking on the name. "Sheriff Monroe, that bastard's been dirty for years." Everything shifted in that moment. The way Monroe had shrugged off the biker attack, the way he'd told me not to poke around in my father's records, the way he always seemed too eager to close a case or brush off questions about anything involving the outskirts of town. He wasn't just negligent. He was involved. And if he knew what we had now, if he even suspected we were this close to the truth, he wouldn't hesitate to bury it. Or us, Grizzly looked at me, eyes hard. "We've got one shot at this," he said, and we can't trust anyone but each other. I nodded slowly, the weight of the coin still pressing into my palm, like a promise and a threat all at once. Because this wasn't just about finishing what my father started. It was about surviving long enough to make sure the truth didn't die with us. The sun hadn't yet risen over the ridge when I realized, with a calmness that surprised even me, that there was no version of the story where we all walked away unscathed, no tidy ending where justice simply prevailed and the guilty turned themselves in under the crushing weight of guilt or fear. Because men like Monroe and Clyde Malone didn't operate in the realm of guilt, and they didn't fear people like me, at least not yet. There was no fantasy here, no John Wayne moment where the cavalry rolled in just in time to clean up the mess and restore order. This was going to end in blood or silence, and I had to decide which of those I could live with, and whether living with either was even possible anymore. Grizzly had barely slept, and what little rest he did manage was done with one eye open and a loaded pistol within reach, the same way he probably slept in jungles, deserts, and war-torn towns, where nothing stayed safe for more than a heartbeat. I listened to the rhythm of his footsteps as he paced back and forth across the floorboards, his boots creaking softly in the dark like a slow countdown. And I knew without asking that he was already forming the plan in his head, already weighing the risks against the smaller, more precious possibility that we might actually succeed in dragging this thing out of the shadows long enough to kill it for good. By mid-morning, the decision was made. We couldn't go to the sheriff's office, not now, not when Monroe was already part of the rot. And we couldn't rely on the local FBI field office either, not after Grizzly pointed out that 2 of the names on the list were former liaisons stationed in that very building, both flagged in the files for covering weapons transfers out of El Paso 3 years ago. That meant we needed outside help, people who didn't owe anyone in this town anything, people with clean hands and long memories. Fortunately, my father had made arrangements for that too. Inside the flash drive, buried under layers of encrypted files and hidden in what looked like corrupted data clusters, was a contact list coded in old military slang. Nothing that made sense to anyone without clearance and a long-standing history in Black Ops communications. Grizzly translated the list like he was reading a faded family recipe, each alias triggering a frown or a low grunt of recognition as he jotted down numbers and confirmed identities against his own private ledger. One I suspected he kept locked inside his head because it was safer that way. We made the call using a burner phone purchased 2 towns over, and the conversation lasted less than 60 seconds. Grizzly spoke in clipped, deliberate phrases, never once saying my name, never once mentioning my father, but when he hung up, he nodded just once and said, "They're coming, we've got until nightfall to keep it all alive." So we did what people like us do when there's nothing left but the truth and the gunpowder that carries it. We set a trap, one final time. We leaked information on a secure but traceable channel, an intentional breadcrumb designed to give Clyde Malone exactly what he wanted to see. That we had the list, that we were scared, and that we were ready to run. We picked an abandoned barn near the outskirts of town, a place my father once used for survival training back when I was a teenager, and he still believed he could prepare me for every kind of enemy except the ones who wore smiles and uniforms. Grizzly rigged the perimeter with trip sensors, just enough to let us know when they were close, and I tucked the coin into a ceramic coffee mug filled with water, the chip submerged just deep enough to short its internal transmitter if someone tried to scan it without knowing what it really was. Night fell hard, bringing with it a storm that rolled across the hills like a promise of chaos, the wind howling through broken boards and rusted tin, like a warning whispered too late. The first of them arrived just after 8. Tommy Malone, bruised and limping from the last encounter, a look of smug satisfaction glued to his face like he'd already won. He was followed by 2 others, and though I couldn't see them, I could hear the way they moved, heavy and loud and overconfident. The way amateurs sound when they think a blind woman and an aging war dog can't possibly pose a threat. "You made it easy," Tommy sneered as he stepped into the light, boots echoing across the concrete floor like punctuation marks at the end of a cruel joke. Should have kept running. I didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't move. He reached for the mug, eyes fixed on what he assumed was his prize, and just as his fingers touched the ceramic, I whispered, calm as a confession, "That chip's dead. You just triggered the signal." For a heartbeat, he froze, processing what I'd said. And in that breathless pause, the sound of boots, different boots, deliberate and heavy, cut through the storm like the first note of a requiem. Doors burst open, floodlights snapped on, and the barn was filled not with the roar of gunfire, but with the calm, ruthless efficiency of trained men doing what they'd been waiting to do for years. Federal agents, real ones, stormed the space with precision that no local force could have faked, taking down Malone's men with non-lethal force, cuffing wrists, silencing mouths, and dragging secrets into the open where sunlight and consequence finally met. Tommy was the last to hit the ground, cursing through clenched teeth, and when they pulled him away, he locked eyes with me for the briefest moment, confusion mixing with fury, as he finally understood he hadn't walked into a victory, but a burial. We watched from the sidelines, Grizzly and I, backs pressed to the wall as the agents secured the space, their leader nodding once in our direction as if to say, "Message received. No thanks necessary." They took the chip, the mug, the photo from my porch, and a signed statement I'd prepared that would never see a courtroom but would find its way into an internal file marked closed. Monroe, for his part, was found halfway to the state line, pulled over by a squad of unmarked vehicles that had been waiting for him to run. I didn't see the arrest, but I heard the aftermath. How he begged, how he named names, how he threw everyone under the bus to save himself. But it wouldn't matter. They were all going down together. Back at the hospital, I sat beside Grizzly's bed, his arm wrapped in a sling, his side stitched where a lucky punch from one of Malone's men had torn muscle, but not spirit. The nurse kept giving me sideways looks, probably trying to figure out who we were and why two people like us looked like we'd walked out of someone else's war story. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the empty coin shell, smooth and cold, and now just a relic of the truth it once held. I thought about burying it. I thought about burning it. But in the end, I slid it back into the velvet lining of my father's metal case, closing the lid with a quiet finality that felt more honest than anything I'd said in weeks. There was a final recording on the flash drive, one Grizzly hadn't shown me until it was all over, and when I played it later that night, sitting alone on my porch with the wind rustling through the trees like a voice too tired to keep shouting, I heard my father's voice one last time. "If you've made it this far, then you've done what I couldn't. You've turned the page, Rachel. Don't go looking for another war. This one was enough for both of us." I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the weight settle, not as a burden, but as a truth I could finally carry without it cutting into my palms. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like someone's daughter chasing ghosts. I felt like myself, unfinished maybe, but no longer afraid.